Multi-role fighters dominate the skies around the world. These fast attack aircraft combine the role of fighter and bomber in one deadly machine, delivering missiles and bombs and defending themselves against other aircraft. This modern weapon system has its roots in the air combat of World War II, which saw the birth of the very first fighter bombers, aircraft of awesome power and precision which could shatter the enemy's forces.
They went down and looked for trains or barges on the river or any enemy installations such as airfields, and wherever we could find a suitable target, we were turned loose. That was playtime.
At the beginning of World War II, there were two main kinds of military aircraft, fighters and bombers. Fighters escorted the bombers on their raids, intercepting other fighter planes. This was the kind of aerial warfare seen during the Battle of Britain in the summer of 1940. Spitfires and Hurricanes flew up to challenge the high-altitude German bombers. But Adolf Hitler and the German army had also devised a new form of warfare, the blitzkrieg. Tanks pierced the enemy lines and encircled them. These armored columns were closely supported by specially designed ground attack aircraft. This was the role of the Junkers Ju-87 dive bomber, known as the Stuka. Equipped with sirens to add terror to its steep diving attacks, it played a leading role in Hitler's blitzkrieg victories against Poland and then France in 1940. Vernon Scannell recalls the terror of being dive-bombed at Dunkirk.
We were lying out waiting for this craft to come in to pick us up, when a German Stuka came over and dive-bombing and machine-gunning the beaches where we were all laid out on stretchers. That was absolutely terrifying. I was convinced I was going to get it. Having got so far with the idea of being in nice clean sheets back in Blighty, I thought, my God, they're going to get me after all.
Dive-bombing attacks on British ships in the Channel at the beginning of the Battle of Britain were devastating, but the Stuka proved vulnerable to attack by British fighters and was shot down in large numbers. It never had the opportunity to overwhelm British civilians with its terror dives. And the Germans were already thinking of a new kind of aircraft, a ground attack bomber and fighter combined. Some of their most famous fighters, such as the Messerschmitt Bf-110 and the Focke-Wulf FW-190, were also re-equipped for a ground attack bombing role. The lesson was not lost on the RAF as it began to go on the offensive. It needed a single-engine aircraft with the dog-fighting capability of a fighter but the punch of a bomber. The RAF found the answer in its most tried and tested fighter. The Hawker Hurricane had shot down more enemy aircraft than any other fighter during the Battle of Britain, including the Spitfire. It was rugged and reliable, and crucially, it was also available in large numbers. A new version of the Hurricane, the M2, was armed with either 8 Browning machine guns or 4 20mm cannon in its wings. Extra armor plating protected it in low-altitude attacks. Most importantly, it had racks for carrying 2 bombs. The Hurricane was Britain's first fighter bomber, but its designers hadn't finished. Fitted with 40mm cannon and later rockets, it became a potent tank buster. Such fighter bombers saw action in North Africa in 1942. At the Battle of El Alamein, British and Commonwealth soldiers of the 8th Army fought to break through the minefields of the Axis armies. They were supported by the British Desert Air Force, sending hundreds of sorties of fighter bombers against the German tanks and gun positions. These relentless assaults finally overwhelmed General Erwin Rommel's forces. They began a long and bitter retreat across North Africa. All the time they were strafed by Allied ground attacks. In Tunisia, the RAF was joined by the U.S. Air Force in its Curtiss Kitty Hawks. Armed with 3 machine guns in each wing, they carried 1 bomb under their fuselage and 6 bombs on wing racks. The victory in North Africa was the first great land victory won by the Allies. The fighter bomber had more than proved its worth. So much so that Allied infantry now wanted fighter bombers to assist them in all ground attacks. The result was a so-called cab rank system. Units of fighter bombers circled the battlefield like cabs waiting for fares. Reconnaissance aircraft were used to spot the positions of enemy formations as well as friendly units.
This was backed up by ground control officers advancing with front-line troops. Battlefield commanders could then call in precise tactical airstrikes almost immediately from the waiting fighter bombers. The enemy reeled before such closely coordinated air assaults. By 1943, the value of the fighter bomber had been proven. The Allies had won air superiority with a new breed of aircraft. Foremost among these was the American P-47 Thunderbolt. As the Allies took the war into Nazi-occupied Europe, it would play a key role in this new phase. The Thunderbolt was originally intended to be a lightweight interceptor, but by the time the first prototype was being tested, it was clear that a much bigger and better armed fighter was needed. The P-47 was completely redesigned with a massively larger engine and 8 machine guns rather than the original 2. The first Thunderbolts were shipped to Britain during the latter part of 1942 and went into action with the US 8th Air Force as an escort fighter in January 1943. The speed, power and rugged build of the P-47 soon led to it being adapted as a fighter bomber, carrying 3 bombs or 10 rockets. It first saw action as a fighter bomber in Italy and proved an immediate success with its pilots. Its heavyweight armor meant it could soak up lots of punishment as it made its low-level attacks. Thunderbolt pilot Frank Mander recalls his role destroying German supply lines.
The target is a bridge, and our mission is to interdict the bridge by dive bombing. As you approach the target, of course, everybody gets lined up depending on whether you're going to attack it from the left or from the right. When the leader gets over his target, then he rolls over, calls a tally-ho, and dives down. After then, of course, his wingmen all follow. Then the flights follow in sequence as you roll over. Then you maneuver around to where you're almost going straight down on your target, and as you're almost in the vertical position, then you release your bombs and pull out of your dive. After the dive bombing run, then the flights pull back up again to altitude and reform. From there, then you will either return home or strike out then on targets of opportunity. Your main mission is to really just hit anything that moves. We would simply shoot them off the road.
The Allied invasion of France was to see the Thunderbolt at its most effective. D-Day, June 1944. The Allies hit the beaches of Nazi-occupied Europe. It was the beginning of the end for the Third Reich. Allied medium and heavy bombers pounded German positions, but there was a need for more precise attacks on the Nazi war machine, and alongside the American Thunderbolts, these were carried out by another classic fighter bomber, the British Hawker Typhoon. Like its US counterpart, this lethal tank killer had a troubled early development. The prototype had flown in 1940, but proved underpowered, and production priority was given to the Hawker Hurricane. By the autumn of 1942, the Typhoon was back in action with a new engine. It still performed poorly at high altitude, but its exceptional performance at low levels made it perfect for ground attack. The RAF deployed 26 squadrons in Normandy, flying almost continuous cab-rank patrols equipped with 2 bombs or 8 armor-piercing rockets. With these, they blasted everything that moved behind enemy lines throughout the campaign in northern France, striking German formations as they advanced along roads or across fields. The Allies soon established total air superiority. Even the most heavily armored German tanks were easy meat for the rockets of the Typhoons and Thunderbolts. Having gained a toehold in occupied France, the next step for the Allies was to break out. But German resistance was stiff and stubborn. Hitler expected his soldiers to resist or die. American troops pushed slowly towards the town of Saint-Lô, but suffered 11,000 casualties on the way. U.S. General Bradley was in command of the American advance and had to find a way through. A major assault named Cobra was planned to break the German line. It would coordinate massive amounts of Allied firepower. The chief weapon chosen to deliver this blow was the heavy bomber. It was decided to blast the German front line at Saint-Lô with a storm of aerial bombing. But the German positions were perilously close to the Allies. A precision attack was needed, and 550 Thunderbolts were chosen for the opening assault. On July the 25th, the Thunderbolts set off on their mission. As they swooped over the Allied positions, they fired their rockets and dropped their bombs in a shattering barrage. It rippled along the German front line, just 300 yards from the sheltering Americans. It was a brilliant display of what the fighter-bomber could do best.
Devastation precisely delivered. Behind them came the high-altitude B-17 bombers. They used the smoke from the Thunderbolt's weapon strikes as a target to drop their bombs, but disaster struck. The wind blew the smoke over the American lines, obscuring their targets. 111 U.S. soldiers were killed by American bombs. 490 were wounded. Nevertheless, the American assault continued. The Thunderbolts returned in further waves to shatter any German attempts at a counterattack. In total, it was the most concentrated use of explosives by U.S. forces during World War II. 70% of the German frontline troops were killed or captured as the Allies finally broke out of their beachhead. Now the fighter-bombers supported a blitzkrieg which surrounded and destroyed two panzer armies and brought Allied troops to the outskirts of Paris in less than 3 weeks. The breakout from Normandy showed how vital the support of fighter-bombers had become, and they continued to harass the enemy as they were forced back to the German border. P-51 Mustangs joined in the action, strafing any German targets they could see. By now, the Allied pilots had little to fear, and if it moves, well, you kill it. You have the ammunition. You paid a hell of a lot to get that ammunition over there. Don't bring it home. We got a lot more at home. Fighter-bombers also had a key role to play in special operations. Few were better suited for this than the de Havilland Mosquito. Air Vice Marshal Basil Embry led one of the most daring Mosquito raids of the war. The aim was to rescue captured Danish resistance leaders. They were held in the Gestapo HQ in Copenhagen. The plan was to use pinpoint bombing to hit the building and release the prisoners. 18 Mosquitoes were readied for the raid on March 12, 1945. For security reasons, because of his seniority, Basil Embry flew under the alias of Wing Commander Smith.
And we took off, and away we went. It was a very stormy-looking morning, a high wind blowing. We crossed out over the English coast and straight away, right down just above the wave.
They flew low to avoid enemy radar. Embry and his crews were keen to hit Copenhagen at precisely 11:15 because that was when they had been told the largest number of Gestapo would be inside the building. Bismarck's navigation and Baton's flying had been so accurate that we were bang on the pinpoint we'd selected to cross into Denmark. We flew down, just missing trees, pulling up over high-tension wires, and all the Danes who were nearby stood up and waved and saluted us, and there was great excitement. The Mosquito raiders were escorted by 28 Mustang fighters, but they were too fast for any German interceptors to bother them. As they swept in over Copenhagen at rooftop level, the main danger came from their own enthusiasm. As I looked up, I saw an aeroplane. It was actually Squadron Leader Carlyle. He was about 3 feet above me. He'd overshot a little bit. He was right on top of me, so I had to go still lower, and I was actually below the level of the rooftops in the main street of Copenhagen, and was worried that my wingtip might catch one of the buildings. The first Mosquitoes dropped their bombs accurately on the Gestapo headquarters. In the chaos, several of the Danish resistance leaders managed to scramble to freedom. As the building burned, all the Gestapo records were destroyed. Across the other side of Europe, the Germans were falling back before the Red Army. Their earlier victories had been reversed, and the Russians were looking for vengeance. The Soviet Air Force took a different approach to the problem of providing close air support for ground troops, and while the Allies and Germans had generally relied on pressing fighters into the ground attack role, the Russians came up with their own unique solution. The Stormelik was a flying tank covered in thick armor and capable of mounting a devastating array of weaponry.
Devastation precisely delivered. Behind them came the high-altitude B-7 bombers. They used the smoke from the Thunderbolt's weapon strikes as a target to drop their bombs. But disaster struck. The wind blew the smoke over the American lines, obscuring their targets. 111 U.S. soldiers were killed by American bombs. 490 were wounded. Nevertheless, the American assault continued. The Thunderbolts returned in further waves to shatter any German attempts at a counterattack. In total, it was the most concentrated use of explosives by U.S. forces during World War II. 70% of the German frontline troops were killed or captured as the Allies finally broke out of their beachhead. Now the fighter bombers supported a blitzkrieg, which surrounded and destroyed 2 panzer armies and brought Allied troops to the outskirts of Paris in less than 3 weeks. The breakout from Normandy showed how vital the support of fighter bombers had become, and they continued to harass the enemy as they were forced back to the German border. P-51 Mustangs joined in the action, strafing any German targets they could see. By now, the Allied pilots had little to fear. And if it moves, well, you kill it. You have the ammunition, you paid a hell of a lot to get that ammunition over there. Don't bring it home. We got a lot more at home. Fighter bombers also had a key role to play in special operations. Few were better suited for this than the de Havilland Mosquito. Air Vice Marshal Basil Embry led one of the most daring Mosquito raids of the war. The aim was to rescue captured Danish resistance leaders. They were held in the Gestapo HQ in Copenhagen. The plan was to use pinpoint bombing to hit the building and release the prisoners. 18 Mosquitoes were readied for the raid on March 12, 1945. For security reasons, because of his seniority, Basil Embry flew under the alias of Wing Commander Smith. And we took off and away we went. It was a very stormy-looking morning, a high wind blowing. We crossed out over the English coast and right straight away right down just above the waves. They flew low to avoid enemy radar. Embry and his crews were keen to hit Copenhagen at precisely 11:15, because that was when they had been told the largest number of Gestapo would be inside the building. Bismarck's navigation and Baton's flying had been so accurate that we were bang on the pinpoint that we'd selected to cross into Denmark. We flew down, just missing trees, pulling up over high-tension wires, and all the Danes who were nearby stood up and waved and saluted us, and there was great excitement. The Mosquito Raiders were escorted by 28 Mustang fighters, but they were too fast for any German interceptors to bother them. As they swept in over Copenhagen at rooftop level, the main danger came from their own enthusiasm. As I looked up, I saw an airplane. It was actually Squadron Leader Carlisle. He was about 3 feet above me. He'd overshot a little bit. He was right on top of me, so I had to go still lower. And I was actually below the level of the rooftops in the main street of Copenhagen and was worried that my wingtip might catch one of the buildings. The first Mosquitoes dropped their bombs accurately on the Gestapo headquarters. In the chaos, several of the Danish resistance leaders managed to scramble to freedom. As the building burned, all the Gestapo records were destroyed. Across the other side of Europe, the Germans were falling back before the Red Army. Their earlier victories had been reversed, and the Russians were looking for vengeance. The Soviet Air Force took a different approach to the problem of providing close air support for ground troops. And while the Allies and Germans had generally relied on pressing fighters into the ground attack role, the Russians came up with their own unique solution. The Ilyushin II Stormik was a flying tank covered in thick armor and capable of mounting a devastating array of weaponry. It carried 2 cannon, 2 machine guns, and 4 rocket-powered bombs on each wing. For special low-level raids, it could be armed with 2 more powerful tank-busting cannons. It tore apart Hitler's remaining armored columns. Under the impact of American, British, and Russian assaults, Hitler's Third Reich was entering its final days, but it could still pull out some deadly surprises. One of these appeared in the late summer of 1944 when a new shape was seen in the skies, a German fighter which could easily outfly anything the Allies possessed. It was the Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first jet fighter to enter combat. This revolutionary aircraft was first ordered into production in 1942, Had the Luftwaffe then been able to use it against the growing Allied bomber offensive, it could have had a devastating effect. But it was another 2 years before it entered active service. Ironically, Hitler's obsession with fighter bombers was largely responsible for this delay. He wanted the Me-262 adapted to carry bombs. The resulting delays meant that it reached frontline units too late, either to stop the invading Allied armies, as Hitler had hoped, or to decimate Allied bombers, as the Luftwaffe chiefs had intended. The Me-262 was armed with 4 20mm cannon, grouped in the nose, and could carry 2 bombs under the fuselage. Its speed of more than 500 miles per hour meant that it was unstoppable when intercepting Allied bombers. 735 Allied aircraft were destroyed by the Me-262, but it was too little, too late. The revolutionary fighter bomber failed to save the Third Reich, and no amount of desperate courage could prevent the final defeat of the Luftwaffe. Its sleek and lethal new fighter was consigned to scrap, but jet power was now the way ahead for all military aircraft. The British Meteor was the only Allied jet to see action in World War II, and it was followed soon after the war by the de Havilland Vampire, the RAF's first specialist ground attack jet aircraft. The world's first swept-wing jet fighter appeared in 1947 with the North American F-86 Sabre. It heralded the arrival of the now familiar shape of today's attack aircraft. Armed with both cannon and missiles, a new age of jet-powered multi-role fighter bombers had emerged out of World War II. These sleek, deadly aircraft continued to dominate the skies. At a U.S. airbase in early November 2001, heavy bombers prepare for action. A few hours later, and halfway around the world, they pound Taliban frontline positions in Afghanistan. It is a terrifying onslaught intended to shatter the fighting spirit of the enemy. A way of war first tested 60 years before. These U.S. aircraft are direct descendants of the high-altitude, long-range heavy bombers first employed in World War II. Weapons that delivered a storm of high explosives from afar, their crews detached from the devastation being caused.
They were like candles floating down in the dark. You have no perception, real perception of depth or height. You see lights below you, they're twinkling, they're the fires, they're the flares, and you see sudden sort of flashes as bombs go off. Never a thought for the people below. The heavy bomber was the most lethal weapon of World War II. Whether a carpet bombing an enemy city or dropping precision bombs on specific military targets, the bomber could deliver an enormous amount of destructive power, far greater than any other weapon system. The first raids by aircraft on civilians came in 1917 over London. 14 Gotha bombers, each carrying 1 ton of explosives, bombed London. Almost 4,000 people were killed or wounded in these early air raids. And after the shattering experience, many military theorists believed that bombers would dominate any future war. Existing fighters were too slow to intercept them. Nightmare prophecies of mass destruction seemed justified when in 1937, during the Spanish Civil War, German bombers were given the go-ahead by fascist leader General Franco to carry out a terrifying experiment. On the morning of April 26th, the German Condor Legion bombed the Basque town of Guernica. After the high explosives came incendiary bombs, setting light to whatever was still standing. The civilian population had no chance. No military target was struck. It was purely intended as a terror tactic. More than 300 civilians were killed. It was a chilling foretaste of what bombers could do. When war came in 1939, Germany was ready, with an impressive aerial armada of bombers such as the Henkel H-111, Junkers J-88, and the Dornier D-07.
They proved an essential part of Hitler's revolutionary blitzkrieg warfare against Poland and then France, supporting ground attacks led by tanks. By the summer of 1940, it appeared that German bombers were a key weapon, bringing victory wherever they flew. Only Britain stood in their way. Hermann Goering, commander of the German Luftwaffe, was highly confident. He promised Hitler his bombers would smash British air defenses in 4 days. But the Battle of Britain revealed startling weaknesses in the German aircraft. They were designed as medium bombers, intended mainly to support land assaults. They could only carry a bomb load of about 4,000 pounds, not enough to deliver knockout blows on British targets. They were also lightly armed, unable to stand up to the savage attacks of RAF Spitfires and Hurricanes. Bombers like this could not win a purely aerial struggle like the Battle of Britain.
but Hitler continued to use them to carry on the indiscriminate bombing of British civilians during the Blitz. In this, he was also misled. Bombing would not break the spirit of the British people, but they did demand vengeance. RAF Bomber Command was put in charge of Britain's retaliation against Germany. At first, like the Luftwaffe, it too had medium bombers. The twin-engined Vickers-Wellington could only carry a bomb load of 5,000 pounds, and it too had to be used at night. This threw up other problems: the lack of adequate navigation and bomb-aiming equipment. Nighttime raids were very much a hit-and-miss affair. Navigator James McLeod recalls the difficulty of finding a target. "We used to climb up into this and then take a star shot. One used to average 6 shots and take the time at the beginning and the time at the end, and then climb down. And with the aid of the navigation tables and the sort of thing that mariners had been doing for years, one worked out where one was, if you were lucky. In fact, on the ground, I found the best I could do was fix the position of the aerodrome within 5 miles. In the air, it would have been lucky if I'd got 20, in my view, and so probabilities was that you would even bomb the wrong town." However, unlike the Luftwaffe, the RAF had anticipated the need for heavy bombers back in 1936, and several different designs were in production. Britain's first 4-engine heavy bomber was the Short Stirling. It entered service in March 1941 and could carry a maximum bomb load of 14,000 pounds, more than 3 times the load of German and British medium bombers. The bomb bay was divided into compartments. This design fort limited the kind of weapons it could carry. Also, in order to get it into a standard RAF hangar, its wingspan was limited. This prevented it from reaching really high altitudes. The Handley Page Halifax was the second 4-engine heavy bomber to come into service with the RAF. It could carry a bomb load of 14,000 pounds and fly at a higher altitude than the Stirling, but it too was flawed. It lacked the range to strike at long-distance German targets. Early in 1942, a new leader arrived who would revolutionize both the RAF and air warfare. Air Marshal Arthur Harris took charge of Bomber Command. In World War I, he'd had frontline experience as a fighter pilot. Between the wars, he became a vital figure at the Air Ministry, helping to prepare Britain's strategy for war. Bomber, or Bert as he was known by his crews, was a blunt and realistic commander. He realized that RAF precision bombing was not accurate enough to knock out specific military targets. Instead, he demanded saturation bombing of enemy towns. Harris knew that the Blitz had failed to break British civilian morale, but was convinced that bombers could win the war against the Third Reich if used in bigger and more destructive raids. There are a lot of people who say that bombing can never win a war. Well, my answer to that is that it has never been tried yet, and we shall see. They sowed the wind, and now they are going to reap the whirlwind. Just after he took over, Harris received the weapon he needed. The third of the British heavy bomber designs, the 4-engined Avro Lancaster, was already in production and came into service in March 1942. Its spacious bomb bay meant it could carry a bigger, more powerful payload, culminating in the massive 22,000-pound Grand Slams. The Lancaster became the mainstay of Bomber Command's raids over Germany, flying over 150,000 missions. It could defend itself with pairs of machine guns set in 3 rotating turrets on the rear, top, and front of the aircraft. These were crucial as long-range fighter escorts were not yet available. The Lancaster also carried the much-improved, highly accurate Mark I 14 bomb sight and an increasingly sophisticated array of guidance equipment. The first of these was oboe. The bombers picked up a radar pulse, which guided them on an arc towards the target. A second radar pulse then told them when to drop their bombs. Later came H2S. This was an onboard radar which provided a map-like picture of the landscape beneath. Bombing raids could now be much more precise in the targets they hit. Harris's Lancaster bombers were state-of-the-art aircraft, but the crews still faced great dangers. The improvements in their equipment were being matched by that of their enemy. German air defense consisted of radar, squadrons of night fighters, and anti-aircraft batteries with searchlights, all integrated in a system that took a heavy toll of Allied bombers. Navigator Dr. Noble Franklin recalled the fear before flying a mission.
Now, of course, in Bombing Command, most of us really wrote ourselves off because, you see, you've got about 16 aircraft operating in a squadron, and night after night you go out and you lose 1, 2, 3, sometimes even 4 aircraft. So you can imagine that if you're doing a tour of operations of about 30 sorties, if you survive it, you'll see 30 or 40 crews go west. On March the 28th, 1942, Harris sent 250 bombers on his first major raid against a German city. He chose the Baltic port of Lübeck. He knew it was lightly defended. Incendiary bombs were dropped first, creating fires among the wood-timbered buildings. Then came the high-explosive bombs and more incendiaries. Lübeck was ruined. Over 1,000 Germans were killed or wounded, the highest civilian toll so far of any raid on Germany. Now the inhabitants of every German city knew they were vulnerable, and soon Harris's bombers had begun a 3-year campaign which devastated every part of Germany. The pressure was building on Nazi Germany. British bombing raids were reducing its cities to rubble, but this was not enough. Bomber Command Leader Arthur Harris wanted to deliver a sledgehammer blow to show the full effect of what his planes could achieve. An indication of the destruction intended was the operation code name Gomorrah. It would be the first combined bomber offensive by the British and American Air Forces. The U.S. 8th Air Force, nicknamed the Mighty Eighth, had arrived in Britain during the summer of 1942. For Harris's assault on Hamburg, it was planned the British bombers would strike at night while the Americans attacked during the day. On the night of July 25, 1943, the first wave of British bombers took off. Over the next 4 days, almost 800 bombers hit the German port with incendiaries and high-explosive bombs. Hans Brunig remembers the night the bombers came. The first bombs fell at midnight. The inexplicable phenomenon for us was the beginning of a firestorm. 1 hour later, clouds of sparks sucked along streets at about 50 feet a second, firing more and more buildings. Flames with 10, 15, 20 meters length leaked from one side of the street to the other. 44,000 people died in the assault on Hamburg. But even though the raids shook the morale of the German people, they did not break as Harris had hoped. But the Allied Blitz did have another effect. To defend all the towns, there were tied up 10,000 anti-aircraft guns heavier than 88 millimeters, and also ammunition which was necessary in these towns was enormous amount. Despite this apparent success, the American daylight assaults were soon facing a crisis. Their mainstay was the legendary 4-engined high-altitude Boeing B-7 Flying Fortress. It carried 13 machine guns, some in hydraulically operated turrets, as well as protective armor and self-sealing fuel tanks. It had a maximum altitude of 35,000 feet and a maximum speed of more than 300 miles per hour. The Flying Fortress could only carry a bomb load of 6,000 pounds, but the accuracy of its Norden bomb sight more than made up for this. With this impressive machine, the U.S. Army Air Force had decided it was worth the risk of flying daytime bombing missions. They were convinced the Flying Fortresses would be able to take care of any fighter opposition. But however tightly they were packed together for mutual support, the slower bombers proved vulnerable to coordinated attacks by Nazi interceptors. Many were shot down. The bomber losses were tremendous. Remembering that each bomber had 10 or 11 men on it, we were losing up to 50 bombers per mission.
This was a horrendous figure to absorb in your daily life. There, 500 or 600 men being wiped out. 500 or 600 families were being berefted. This is something that is very difficult to take. One goes to breakfast with his crewmates and squadron mates. One comes to dinner that evening, and maybe a quarter of them aren't there any longer. By mid-1943, daylight losses had become so great that the American raids had to be suspended. They could only be resumed in early 1944 with the arrival of a long-range fighter escort. The P-51D Mustang could now accompany U.S. bombers all the way to Berlin and back. Their arrival was a sea change in the bombing campaign.
We dominated the air over there, the P-51, and gradually beat the Luftwaffe to its knees through damage to their production facilities for their combat aircraft, damage to their oil production facilities so they could not keep up with the training demands of new pilots,
so that their typical pilot near the end of the war was quite inexperienced and rather easy prey for our, by then, highly experienced P-51 pilots.
Until the end of the war, there remained a fundamental difference of approach between the two Allied bomber forces. The Americans preferred to concentrate their bombing as precisely as possible on strategically important targets such as war, industry, fuel supplies, and communications. But Bomber Command's Arthur Harris still believed in mass assaults on towns and cities. As the war neared its end, 1,600 acres of Dresden were annihilated in just one night of bombing. It was one of the great horrors of the war, in which 100,000 civilians died. Germany had truly reaped the whirlwind of bombing destruction. But Harris had misjudged his enemy. The morale of the German people was not broken. The promise that terror bombing would win the war did not come true for either side in Europe. And a terrible price had been paid by the victors as well as the vanquished. RAF Bomber Command lost 55,000 servicemen killed. The U.S. 8th Air Force lost 26,000. The same lesson had to be learned in the war with Japan. The tremendous distances of the Pacific Ocean meant that bombing did not play a major role in the first part of this conflict. American raids on Japan could only begin in earnest with the development of the Boeing B-29 Super Fortress. This was the most innovative four-engined heavy bomber produced during the war. It had a pressurized cabin and could fly at 36,000 feet. Prototypes were ordered in 1940, but such was the advanced technology of this new machine that it did not fly in combat until 1944. With a maximum speed of 350 miles per hour, it could carry a bomb load of 20,000 pounds. With extra fuel tanks added, it had a range of over 4,000 miles. 500-strong Superfortress bombing rays were launched from U.S. bases in the Marianas Islands from late 1944. But these high-altitude daylight precision bombing assaults proved to be a failure. Poor weather hampered accuracy, and kamikaze Japanese fighters rammed many bombers. A dramatic switch was made to their tactics. Low-level night raids were carried out using incendiary bombs. The majority of Japanese houses were built of wood. The results were horrific. On the night of March the 9th, 1945, 15 square miles of Tokyo were devastated in a firestorm that killed at least 80,000 people. But once again, terrible as they were, these raids did not break the enemy's will. Then a single attack by one single bomber in August brought the beginning of the end. On August the 6th, 1945, a super fortress called Enola Gay took off to bomb the Japanese port of Hiroshima. It flew alone, undetected, at high altitude. The bomb it carried heralded a whole new era of warfare. At 8:16 a.m., the first atom bomb was dropped. A second on the city of Nagasaki followed 3 days later. In the two attacks, at least 120,000 people died immediately, with another 400,000 fatally injured. Japan surrendered. It was a defining moment. Bombers had fulfilled their war-winning promise. But it was the bomb, not the bomber, that won the war. For the next 50 years, the Cold War was dominated by the image of giant bombers ready to annihilate mankind in a few hours. Mercifully, the moment never came. But even today, despite the development of missiles, the giant bombers remain ready to retaliate if any nation should be foolhardy enough to embark on a new battle of the bombers.